She wasn't loud, she wasn't late, she wasn't disruptive, she was just in the wrong line, or at least that's what they believed. At a busy airport terminal, a poised black woman stood in the business class queue, calm, silent, carrying nothing but a boarding pass and the quiet power of dignity. But to two white officers and a privileged passenger, her very presence was a threat. No raised voice, no broken rule, and yet minutes later she was handcuffed, publicly humiliated, escorted away like a criminal. But there was one thing they didn't know. They had just arrested the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals, and what happened next would change everything. The rhythmic hum of flight announcements echoed across the polished marble floor of Bristol Liberty International Airport. It was late Friday afternoon, and the terminal pulsed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, scattered voices, and the occasional tired child's cry. At Gate D9, a line of business-class passengers began to form for Flight 228 to Atlanta. Some scrolled through their phones, others clutched coffee cups or leafed through boarding passes. Amid the noise and motion, one woman stood quietly, her stillness a kind of quiet protest against the rush around her. Celeste Morgan, 53, wore her dignity like she wore her clothing elegantly, without excess. A tailored black blazer rested over a deep charcoal blouse, her trousers crisp, her shoes sensible but refined. Her hair was swept into a neat, low bun, and a soft leather bag rested beside her carry-on. There were no flashy accessories, just a silver watch and a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle more people than she realized. She wasn't reading, talking, or making a scene. She was simply waiting, alone. A few feet behind her in line, Madeline Cross stood draped in designer labels and entitlement. In her mid-60s, Madeline's sharp eyes peered over pearl-framed sunglasses, darting between the boarding gate and the people ahead. But it wasn't the slow-moving line that bothered her, it was Celeste. Madeline's lips tightened. Her gaze lingered too long on Celeste's skin. Her brain, wired by a lifetime of unchallenged assumptions, struggled to reconcile what she saw. A poised black woman standing confidently in the business class line, not an assistant, not a +1, just her. A direct contradiction to everything Madeline believed about how the world should work. She must be in the wrong line, Madeline muttered, not quietly. Or worse, using someone else's boarding pass. The man beside her shifted awkwardly, but Madeline wasn't done. She clicked her heels forward, bypassing the queue and stepping up to the gate agent with a huff. The young woman behind the desk, barely out of college, glanced up politely. "Excuse me," Madeline began, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Why do I have to wait in line with everyone?" The agent blinked. "Ma'am, this is the business class queue." "Yes, I know," Madeline interrupted. "But that woman," she tilted her head toward Celeste, "has been watching me, staring at my luggage. I don't feel safe flying next to someone like that. You should check her ticket. I doubt it's even real." The agent faltered. I'm not sure I understand." Ms. Morgan checked in properly. She has priority boarding like all other business class passengers." But Madeline's tone shifted from complaint to performance, carefully constructed to trigger action. "Listen, these are dangerous times. If something happens on that plane and you ignored a warning, it'll be on you." And passengers nearby began to glance toward the desk. Madeline's words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. She knew how to speak the language of insinuation, the subtle poison of racial suspicion dressed in the language of safety and just being cautious. And it worked. Because in America, for far too long, that kind of fear came with power. The gate agent hesitated. Her hand hovered near her radio. And in that brief moment before anything official had even happened, Celeste Morgan, still waiting silently at the front of the line, became a target. Not for what she'd done, but for what she represented. For the color of her skin, for the calm in her stance, for daring to exist in a space someone like Madeline believed she didn't belong. And that was all it took to start a fire. The call came through quietly but with urgency. The gate agent, caught between the pressure of protocol and the fear of being blamed for inaction, tapped her radio and relayed a vague concern about a suspicious passenger at Gate D9. Within minutes, officers Trent Wallace and Ethan Granger emerged from the nearby security corridor. Wallace, the senior of the two, moved with the weary stride of someone who had spent too many years behind a badge and not enough behind reflection. Granger, younger and more volatile, walked with a swagger that suggested power was something he wore like armor, loud and ready to be used. As they approached the gate, Madeline Cross met them halfway. "There she is," she said softly but firmly, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward Celeste. "I don't feel safe. She's been watching me. Her eyes, they make me uncomfortable." Wallace didn't ask for evidence. Granger didn't ask for context. Neither officer asked the most important question of all. Why would a poised, calm woman simply standing in a boarding line be considered a threat? But that question never made it past their biases. Instead, they exchanged a glance silent, but loaded with assumption, and moved in the direction of Celeste Morgan. She saw them coming before they said a word. The line grew quiet as the officers approached. People shifted, glanced sideways, held their breath. The hum of casual travel gave way to a different kind of silence, one that often preceded humiliation. "Ma'am," Officer Wallace said, voice tight with faux politeness, "we need to speak with you. Step aside, please." Celeste didn't flinch. Her posture remained composed as she turned to face them, hands resting lightly by her side. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We've received a report about you," Granger said bluntly, his eyes narrowing. "Suspicious behavior, potential security concern." "A report?" Celeste repeated, measured and steady. "And what exactly was I reported for?" Wallace stepped in. "We're not here to debate. Just need your identification and boarding pass." With calm precision, Celeste opened her handbag and produced both. "Here are my documents. Everything is in order. Now may I ask the basis of this so-called suspicion?" Granger took the boarding pass and examined it as though its validity were improbable. "Business class, huh?" he muttered, casting a glance at her attire, her bag, her skin. Then came the questions, not official, not procedural, but personal, loaded. "What do you do for a living, Ms. Morgan?" Wallace asked, eyes scanning her from head to toe. Celeste replied without hesitation. "I'm in law." Granger chuckled dryly. "Interesting. Must be a good job if it gets you into business class." His tone dripped with disbelief, not curiosity. Celeste's jaw tightened, but her voice remained even. "Is there a specific reason my profession or seat class is under scrutiny?" "No need to get defensive," Wallace said. "We're just trying to understand how someone like you—" He let the sentence trail off, unfinished but fully understood. "Someone like you. Not someone suspicious, not someone dangerous. Just someone black in the wrong place, a place society still whispers she doesn't belong." Celeste took a slow breath. "Officers, unless there is a legitimate concern backed by policy or law, I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other traveler in this terminal." But the line had already been crossed. The questioning wasn't about protocol. It was about putting her in her place subtly, but deliberately. And in that moment, Celeste Morgan realized something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a performance, a quiet show of dominance. And she was no longer just a traveler. She was being profiled, challenged, tested, and she would not yield. Celeste Morgan had dealt with men like Officers Wallace and Granger before, men who wore their uniforms like shields and their insecurities like weapons, men who mistook calm resistance for arrogance and dignity for defiance. But standing here under the fluorescent glare of Gate D9, it became clear that this wasn't just about power, it was about control, and they weren't used to being questioned. "I've given you my identification," Celeste said, her voice cool and deliberate. "Now, I'd like to know your full names and badge numbers, please." The air around them tightened. Granger's jaw tensed first. Wallace gave a faint scoff, as if the request itself were an insult. "You think this is some kind of courtroom?" Wallace snapped. "We're not on trial here, lady." "No," Celeste replied evenly, "but your behavior is being observed by more people than you realize." She wasn't wrong. Dozens of passengers were now watching, heads turned, phones lowered, conversations silenced. A hush had fallen over the terminal, the kind that happens when something is about to go terribly wrong. Granger took a step closer, his hand twitching near his belt. "You don't get to talk to us like that. You don't question us." "I'm not questioning," Celeste corrected, her tone still measured. "I'm asserting my rights as a citizen." And that was it. That one sentence, grounded in fact, delivered without emotion, hit like a slap across pride and prejudice. "You think you're better than us?" Granger barked suddenly, his voice louder now. "Walking around with your fancy ticket and your attitude, acting like the rules don't apply to you?" "I've broken no rules," Celeste said. "Don't play the victim," Wallace spat. "You're acting hostile. You're resisting." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A mother pulled her child closer. A businessman lowered his coffee cup mid-sip. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one dared to name it. And then, without warning, Granger lunged. He grabbed Celeste's wrist with force, twisting her arm behind her back. She gasped, not out of fear but pain, as her shoulder was jerked sideways. "You have no right," she began, but her voice was cut off by Wallace's barked order. "Put her in cuffs, now!" Metal clashed. The sharp snap of handcuffs closing around Celeste Morgan's wrists echoed across the gate like a gunshot. Her hands were forced behind her back, her chin held high, but her eyes burned with restrained fury. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. But humiliation washed over her like a flood. The officers flanked her on both sides, gripping her arms tightly. Wallace's face twisted into a sneer. "Let's see how high and mighty you are now." Behind them, silence hung heavy. Passengers looked on with disbelief, their expressions ranging from stunned to horrified. Some instinctively reached for their phones, too hesitant to record, but too disturbed to look away. The gate agent stood frozen, her hand hovering near the radio again, paralyzed by the enormity of what she'd set in motion. Celeste, now restrained like a criminal, turned slightly toward the crowd. Her eyes met theirs one by one. Some looked away, others held her gaze, ashamed they hadn't spoken up. But Celeste wasn't asking for pity. She was bearing witness. This wasn't an arrest. It was a message. A black woman had stepped out of place, and this was her punishment. And somewhere nearby, just out of frame, Madeline Cross folded her arms and smiled. The cold bite of the steel cuffs still stung her wrists, but Celeste Morgan didn't wince. She didn't give them that. Her back remained straight as Officer Trent Wallace gripped her left arm and Officer Ethan Granger held the other, guiding No, parading her through the terminal like a trophy of their authority. Her heels clicked against the floor, steady and sharp, the sound unnervingly composed for a woman in chains. Gate D9 slowly disappeared behind her, and yet its silence followed her like a shadow. She could feel the weight of eyes on her from every direction, travelers, gate agents, ground staff. Some whispered, others stood frozen in disbelief. A few looked away, ashamed. But no one stepped forward. No one asked the officers what crime had been committed. No one asked why a well-dressed, middle-aged black woman had been dragged away like a threat. Celeste didn't look down. Her chin stayed lifted, her steps deliberate. The pain was real, her shoulders ached from the awkward angle of the cuffs, but the deeper wound was not physical. It was dignity under siege. She passed a family of tourists, the mother shielding her daughter's view. A group of business travelers paused mid-conversation. One man shook his head slightly, another lowered his phone, unwilling to intervene, but equally unwilling to forget what he'd just seen. Celeste saw them all. She wasn't just walking through the terminal, she was memorizing it. Every face, every sound, every detail etched itself into her mind with chilling clarity. The smell of overbrewed coffee, the blinking departure screens, the tiny crack in the tile near gate C4, the silence of a nation too often complicit. As they neared the security station at the far end of the terminal, Wallace leaned in slightly, his voice low but sharp. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he muttered. Celeste didn't answer. She didn't need to, because in her silence was a storm. And as they turned the final corner toward the airport police wing, Celeste caught sight of her reflection in the glass wall beside a closed duty-free shop. The image was haunting. Two white men in uniform, flanking a restrained black woman whose only crime was expecting to be treated like a citizen. She studied herself, not with pity, but with precision. This was not the end of her story. This was only documentation. She was building a case in her mind, stone by stone, every insult, every unlawful act, every public humiliation, now a piece of evidence. And if there was one thing Celeste Morgan understood better than most, it was the architecture of justice. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from calculation. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe they'd subdued her. For now, she would let the cuffs speak. Let the march play out. Let the crowd bear witness. But when the time came, and it would come, she would speak in a courtroom, not a terminal. And this walk, which they thought would define her shame, would become the opening argument to something much larger. They just didn't know who they were walking beside. Yet. The door to the airport police station creaked open with a dull metallic groan as Celeste Morgan was led inside, her cuffed hands still behind her back. The sterile room was a harsh contrast to the bustling terminal fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, a linoleum floor too clean to feel real, and a metal desk where a lone intake officer sat tapping slowly on a keyboard. He didn't look up right away. Wallace cleared his throat as he guided Celeste toward the desk. "We've got a potential disruptor here. loud, uncooperative, may pose a flight risk. Resisted instructions, Granger added quickly, his voice sharp with adrenaline. Tried to intimidate us, made a scene at gate D9. The intake officer finally glanced up, lazily at first until his eyes landed on the woman standing silently between them. There was something in Celeste's posture that didn't match their report, something unsettling in her composure. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying, she wasn't begging, she was just waiting. The officer blinked, confused, but returned to his task. Name? Celeste Morgan, she said clearly. Age? 53. Address? She answered again, each response crisp and deliberate. He typed it in, pausing briefly as he read her name on the screen. Something flickered across his face. Hesitation? Familiarity? He continued anyway. Occupation? A pause. Then Celeste took a single step forward, the steel cuffs clinking behind her as she straightened her back. She locked eyes with the intake officer. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I am Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals. The silence that followed was not empty. It was catastrophic. The intake officer froze mid-keystroke. His eyes darted back to the screen, then up to her face, then back again. He looked at her ID still in Wallace's hand. Then he looked at the officers flanking her. Wallace blinked, confused. What? I said, Celeste repeated, slower this time, I am Chief Judge Celeste Morgan of the United States Court of Appeals. Her voice didn't shake. It rang with a cool, unmistakable authority. Not pride, not vengeance, just truth, served with the precision of someone who had spoken it from behind a bench for over 2 decades. Granger took a step back as if struck. Wallace's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room felt suddenly too small, too bright, too loud. The intake officer, visibly pale now, nearly knocked over his chair as he stood. Chief Judge of the... Yes, she confirmed, her gaze sweeping slowly toward Wallace and Granger. That would be me. The 2 officers, so confident just moments earlier, looked as though the floor beneath them had split open, their faces drained of color, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of realization. They hadn't just profiled a passenger. They had handcuffed a federal judge. They had shouted at, humiliated, and unlawfully detained one of the most powerful figures in the American judiciary because a white woman pointed and said she felt uncomfortable, because they saw skin before credentials, because they believed no one would question them. Celeste studied them in silence, not with rage, but with the calm of someone who knew exactly what came next. Uncuff me, she said finally, not to Wallace or Granger, but to the stunned intake officer. He fumbled for the keys, his hands trembling as he rushed to obey. The metal bit into her wrists one last time before releasing with a sharp snap. Red marks circled her skin, silent witnesses to everything that had just unfolded. As she rubbed her wrist gently, Celeste's voice remained composed. Now, she said, you're going to call the chief of airport police. Then you're going to contact the U.S. Marshals. And after that, I want the chief clerk of the Court of Appeals on the line. No one moved. She leaned forward. That wasn't a suggestion. The room felt colder now. The badge didn't matter anymore. Nor did the uniform, the walk, or the bluster. What once made Officers Wallace and Granger feel untouchable was now reduced to threadbare fabric clinging to men who had just discovered how far they'd fallen and how fast. Celeste Morgan was no longer just a passenger. She was now speaking as a chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals. And the 2 officers who had publicly humiliated her were realizing too late that their moment of unchecked arrogance had just become a career-ending disaster. Wallace's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat constricted as his mind scrambled for a lifeline that didn't exist. Chief Morgan, he finally choked, the words barely above a whisper. We didn't know. Celeste didn't respond. She simply stood tall, her gaze fixed, her expression unreadable calm, but razor sharp. Granger, meanwhile, collapsed, quite literally. His knees hit the floor with a dull thud, hands shaking in front of him like a man on trial for his soul. His face, once hardened with smug confidence, now trembled with panic. Please, Your Honor, we didn't know who you were. It wasn't personal, he stammered, his voice cracking. We were just doing our job. Please, don't ruin our lives. I have 2 kids, one in kindergarten. His words spilled into the sterile room like spilled gasoline, desperate, frantic, flammable. But Celeste didn't flinch. She had heard every kind of plea in her courtroom, some justified, many not. What Granger and Wallace were offering now wasn't remorse. It was damage control. "You didn't know who I was?" she asked, her voice even and cold. "And that's supposed to excuse what you did?" Granger looked up, tears streaking down his face. "Would it have been acceptable if I had been anyone else?" she continued. "A teacher? A nurse? A retiree? Would they have deserved what you did to me just because someone pointed and said they were uncomfortable?" They had no answer, because there wasn't one. Celeste turned toward the duty officer who stood paralyzed behind the desk, still holding the now open cuffs in his hand. "Get the chief of airport police," she said sharply. "Then call the local U.S. Marshal's office. After that, I want the chief clerk of the Court of Appeals notified that I've been detained and assaulted in a federal transportation facility." The officer nodded frantically, snatching the phone as if it might burn him. His fingers slipped over the buttons as he dialed, voice stammering through the introductions. Celeste returned her attention to Wallace, whose breath now came in short, uneven bursts. He looked like a man watching the scaffold being built in real time. "Chief Morgan, we made a mistake," he croaked. "We were following a complaint. We didn't know it would escalate. Please just talk to the chief. We'll apologize. We'll explain." She raised a single hand. He stopped. "This is no longer about your explanation," she said. "It's about accountability." Her tone was not cruel, but it was final. "I gave you every opportunity to do your job correctly. You ignored evidence. You chose assumption over protocol. You humiliated an innocent citizen in public view, and now you'll answer for it." Granger remained on the floor, sobbing silently. Wallace sank into a chair, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. Power had shifted, not with rage, not with shouting, but with clarity and the calm authority of a woman who had been underestimated one time too many. And now, the reckoning had begun. 30 minutes. That was all it took for the gravity of the situation to reach the highest levels of authority and for the walls to start closing in. The small airport police station, tucked away at the far end of Bristol Liberty International, was suddenly no longer just a holding room. It had become the epicenter of a rapidly escalating federal incident. They arrived in waves. First came the chief of airport police, flanked by two deputies, their faces taut with unease. Behind them, high-ranking airport security officials swept in, whispering to each other, their eyes flicking nervously toward Celeste. Soon after, U.S. Marshals entered the room, their movements precise and deliberate, badges gleaming, posture rigid. And then came the judicial representative staff from the U.S. Court of Appeals, their presence alone a signal that this was no ordinary confrontation. Every eye in the room was drawn to one woman. Celeste Morgan stood in the center, uncuffed, unshaken. She did not raise her voice. She didn't have to. The room quieted not out of obedience but reverence. "I'm prepared to give a statement," she said simply. And then, with the same precision she had delivered countless rulings in court, she laid out the entire sequence of events. From the moment she stepped into the business class line at gate D9, to Madeline Cross's calculated accusation, to the officer's arrival, their tone, their words, their assumptions, the slurs, the cuffs, the march through the terminal. She recounted it all not with anger, but clarity. Every action, she said, her gaze sweeping the room, was fueled not by law, but by bias. And that bias nearly turned a respected federal judge into a criminal in the eyes of hundreds of bystanders simply because a white woman decided I didn't look like I belonged. No one interrupted. No one dared. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was devastating. The chief of airport police stepped forward, his face pale. "Chief Judge Morgan, on behalf of this department, I offer our deepest apologies for the violation of your rights and dignity. What happened today was unacceptable." Celeste didn't respond immediately. Her silence forced him to continue. "We will begin an immediate internal investigation, in coordination with federal authorities," he added quickly. "I've already contacted the airport's legal division, and we're activating a full review of all involved personnel." He turned to Wallace and Granger, who now stood in the corner like ghosts of their former selves. "Effective immediately," he said sharply. "Officers Trent Wallace and Ethan Granger are suspended without pay pending further review. Remove their badges, sidearms, and credentials." A gasp rippled through the room. A uniformed officer approached slowly. Wallace didn't resist as his badge was unclipped from his chest. Granger stared blankly ahead as his sidearm was taken from its holster. Their belts felt lighter now because the weight they had once carried wasn't just metal. It was unchecked power, and it was being stripped from them. "This is only the beginning," said one of the U.S. Marshals quietly, flipping open a notebook. "We'll be reviewing security footage, body cam data, and sworn statements from every witness present at Gate D9. Another marshal added, "Federal civil rights investigators have been notified. Depending on the findings, formal charges may follow." As the room shifted into a controlled storm of logistics and protocol, Celeste took a breath not of relief, but of resolve. This wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was the first undeniable sign that the system, however flawed, was waking up to itself, and accountability had finally found its footing. The investigation began before the echoes of Celeste Morgan's statement had even faded from the walls. Within hours, a team from the FBI's Civil Rights Division arrived at Bristol Liberty International Airport. Suited agents moved with quiet urgency through the terminal, requesting access to surveillance systems, interviewing witnesses, and collecting digital evidence. There was no press, no public announcement, just the unmistakable machinery of federal scrutiny turning its full attention to a single event that had peeled back layers of something deeper, uglier, and long-standing. At the center of it all was truth. And the truth was remarkably easy to find. The footage from Gate D9 told a story that no statement could distort. There was Celeste, silent, composed, standing in line like any other passenger. There was Madeline Cross, stepping out of place with exaggerated distress, pointing, whispering to the gate agent, gesturing toward Celeste like she was identifying a threat. And then came Wallace and Granger approaching fast, ignoring protocol, speaking to Celeste not with inquiry, but with accusation. The body cam recordings were worse. Every syllable was preserved. The tone, the sneer, the contempt veiled in authority. Wallace's smirk as he questioned how someone like her could afford business class. Granger's fury when Celeste requested badge numbers, the shouted slurs, the cuffs, the crowd murmuring in disbelief. There was no room for misinterpretation. There was no version, but one. Witnesses, many of whom had initially stayed silent out of fear or uncertainty, began to come forward. Travelers from other gates, a flight attendant on break, even the barista from the coffee stand facing Gate D9. Each confirmed what the footage showed. Celeste had done nothing wrong. She had simply existed where someone didn't want her to, and that someone now had a name, Madeline Cross. A federal investigator knocked on the hotel room door of the airport's airline partner records office, where Madeline's boarding information had been traced. She had flown first class to Charleston, but the investigation had flown faster. Her file was flagged. Official charges were still being prepared, but the implications were clear. Incitement, false statements to law enforcement, and willful participation in racial targeting. The agents interviewing her noted how quickly her story began to shift. Gone was the righteous indignation. Gone were the complaints about feeling unsafe. Now her tone was hesitant, her memory conveniently cloudy. But it was too late. The camera didn't lie. And the officers she had manipulated, they had turned into liability fast. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of federal charges, both Wallace and Granger began to cooperate. Their statements' thinly veiled attempts at mitigation revealed even more about the culture that had enabled them. No formal training in bias response, no recent accountability review, just an unofficial rule: when in doubt, escalate. The FBI didn't take that lightly. Within days, the Civil Rights Division issued a formal notice. A full investigation into the Bristol Airport Police Department was now underway, including its use of force policies, complaint records, and internal disciplinary procedures. And just like that, a single incident, a pair of handcuffs, a woman in line, and a lie whispered too easily had triggered a storm far larger than anyone expected. But Celeste Morgan had expected it. She knew that the fight for justice was rarely clean. It was complex, uncomfortable, and often began in places most people overlook. A line at a gate, a passing glance, a voice amplified by unearned power. But now, finally, that voice was being answered by another, louder, stronger, backed by law, truth, and the full weight of justice. The courtroom was packed. Press lined the back rows. Civil rights attorneys, federal observers, and ordinary citizens filled the benches, many standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Some had come out of solidarity, others out of disbelief that a case like this, so raw, so public, had finally reached the stage of legal reckoning. At the front sat two men in suits that didn't fit them like their uniforms once had. Trent Wallace and Ethan Granger, no longer officers, no longer protected by the veil of authority. Now they were simply defendants accused of violating the civil rights of a federal judge and unlawfully detaining a U.S. citizen without cause. The charges were serious, the stakes even more so. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence, a damning collage of video, audio, and testimony. The jury watched the body cam footage in silence, each word and gesture frozen under courtroom lights. They saw Wallace's smirk, heard Granger's sneer, felt the sting of the racial slurs echoing through the air like gunfire. They watched as Celeste Morgan, dignified and unyielding, was forced into handcuffs before a sea of passengers who said nothing but remembered everything. Then came the testimonies, gate agents, travelers, a flight attendant, each voice adding a new angle to the same truth. There had been no threat, only bias, masked poorly as concern. And finally, there was Celeste. She spoke without bitterness, without rage, just clarity. "I did not demand special treatment," she said, her voice resonating through the wood-paneled chamber. "I expected the same treatment every citizen is owed, no more, no less. But what I received was a judgment not based on my actions, but on the color of my skin and the assumptions tied to it." The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty. Both Wallace and Granger were convicted on multiple counts: violation of civil rights under color of law, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of constitutional protections. The sentencing judge, a longtime federal appointee, was stern and unapologetic. "You did not just fail your oath," he said, eyes fixed on the two former officers. "You turned your authority into a weapon of humiliation. And in doing so, you struck not just one woman, but the integrity of every badge in this nation." He handed down a sentence of 4 years in federal prison to each of them. The courtroom exhaled. It wasn't vengeance, it was accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Commentators debated the implications. Some called it a landmark case, others a long overdue correction. But behind all the noise was a simple truth: the system had listened and acted. As for Madeline Cross, her reckoning came more quietly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, mounting public outrage, and the looming threat of a civil lawsuit filed by Celeste herself, Madeline chose the path of silent surrender. Her attorneys entered a plea deal. She would admit guilt to making false statements to law enforcement and pay a $500,000 penalty to avoid further civil litigation and a possible prison sentence. There was no trial, no testimony, no headline-grabbing courtroom drama, just a signature, a check, and the unraveling of a reputation built on arrogance. But money could not buy back what was lost, and for once, the silence that followed wasn't protection, it was consequence. Celeste Morgan stepped back into her chambers on a crisp Monday morning, the soft light pouring through the tall windows, painting quiet gold across the shelves of legal tomes and framed opinions. Nothing in the room had changed. The desk was where it had always been. The robe still hung neatly on the hook by the door, and yet everything was different. She moved through the space not with triumph but with calm resolve, a woman unchanged by what had been done to her, but forever sharpened by what it revealed. The week after the verdict, her office received thousands of letters. Some came from law clerks she had mentored years ago, others from civil rights attorneys, educators, and complete strangers. A retired black school teacher from Ohio wrote, "For the first time in a long time, I saw someone like me treated like her truth mattered." A law student from Arkansas sent a single sentence, "You didn't flinch, so I won't either." But Celeste didn't return for the praise. She returned for the work. Her docket was full: federal appeals, constitutional reviews, judicial oversight reports. The grind of justice never stopped, and she knew better than anyone that its pace was rarely fast, rarely loud, and never convenient. But now, every ruling she made, every word she wrote carried a shadow of the incident at Bristol Liberty International, not as a burden, but as a beacon. The case had already made its way into judicial training seminars across the country. Civil rights law programs studied it as a modern precedent. Police departments added the footage to their bias training curricula. In legal circles, it was now known simply as Morgan v. Bristol, a lesson etched in steel and silence, in restraint and resolve, and that perhaps was the real legacy of what happened. Celeste had not shouted. She had not struck back. She had not used her title as a shield in the moment of crisis. She had let the system expose itself through its failure, through its reaction, and eventually, through its reckoning. She had shown that true power does not announce itself. It does not panic, and it does not need permission to act. It simply stands its ground, quietly, until the truth becomes too large to ignore. She would never forget the eyes at gate D9, the silence, the shame, the fear. But she would also never forget what came next, the accountability, the turning tide, the quiet collective of people who finally said, enough. In a private moment, as she prepared for her first hearing since returning to the bench, Celeste glanced at the framed photo on her desk, her parents, standing proudly outside the courthouse where she'd taken her first oath. They knew, she thought. They knew this road would be steep, and they were right. But still she climbed. Because justice, she had learned, does not bend when we raise our fists. It bends when we refuse to sit down. And in the end, her greatest act wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the airport, in handcuffs, surrounded by silence where she stood tall, said little, and let the system hear itself speak. She had been wronged, but she never lost herself. And because of that, we all gained something back. Celeste Morgan never raised her voice. She never fought fire with fire. She let the truth speak louder than rage, and it echoed through a courtroom, a nation, and a system that could no longer look away. Because justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it stands in silence in handcuffs, surrounded by people too afraid to speak, but brave enough to remember. This story isn't just about one woman. It's about what happens when someone finally says, enough. If you believe dignity is not a privilege, if you believe no one should have to prove they belong, then don't let this story be forgotten. Comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe not just to hear another voice, but to make sure the right ones are never silenced again.